On August 14th, 2005, a strange and terrifying guest was hovering over the skies of Athens, the capital of Greece. About 10,000 meters above the ground, a passenger plane was circling in absolute silence, without communicating with anyone. What was frightening was that for the past 2 hours, this plane had not responded to any messages from any control tower. Fear had spread through the atmosphere of Athens. Was this a preparation for a terrorist attack or a hijacking event? Because of this fear, the Greek Air Force immediately dispatched its fighter jets after it. When the fighter jets got close to the plane, a soul-shaking sight was seen inside. It was discovered that there was absolute silence inside the plane. No movement, no activity. All passengers were sitting lifeless in their seats, and no one was present in the cockpit either. During this time, the F-16 pilots saw a person in the cockpit who apparently did not look like a pilot. He was moving around in the cockpit as if looking for something or trying to understand something. The next moment, the plane suddenly tilted to one side and began descending rapidly toward the ground. A few minutes later, it crashed into the mountains north of Athens. In this accident, 121 passengers and crew members were all killed. But after all, what was the whole matter? Why was there no movement inside the plane? Why were the pilots and crew members not responding to any calls? And what happened inside after takeoff that later caused a terrifying accident? This is the story of Helios Flight 522, also remembered as the ghost plane. On the morning of August 14th, 2005, 115 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Helios Flight 522 at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. Their destination was the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, but they had to make a stopover in Athens on the way. It was summer season, and most people had set out from Cyprus for vacations and were to disembark in Athens. The captain of this flight was a highly experienced man. At 59 years of age, he had more than 17,000 hours of flying experience. The first officer was also 51 years old and had spent 7,500 hours in the air. Usually, in such accidents, the expertise of the crew is emphasized, but in this case, the story was different. Both these pilots had been together in many flights before, and the first officer had often complained to his friends and family about the captain's pressure and strict behavior. The airline was also aware of this issue beforehand. Not only this, the first officer's training records also revealed that he had trouble with checklist procedures. This was something that was to prove most crucial later. The plane was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. In the cool morning air, the aircraft took off from Larnaca Airport without any issues. As soon as the plane went above 10,000 feet, the crew contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control, and the captain requested permission to fly at an altitude of 34,000 feet, which they were granted. But as the aircraft reached an altitude of 12,000 feet, an alarm suddenly started ringing in the cockpit. This alarm was the same one that usually rang on the ground before takeoff, when there was an issue with the plane's takeoff configuration. Because of this, both pilots were surprised as to why they were hearing it in the air. After 90 seconds, the captain contacted his airline's operations center and told them about the takeoff configuration warning. He also mentioned that the ventilation cooling fan lights were off, and further asked where its circuit breakers were located. The engineer on the ground replied that those lights should be off anyway, and that the circuit breaker is located behind the captain's seat. When the engineer asked the captain to confirm the issue, the captain said they were not off. The engineer did not understand the pilot's response at all. During this time, the engineer remembered something. Before the flight, this same engineer had checked the aircraft's pressurization system because its controls were near the controls about which the captain was giving confused answers. Because of this, the engineer asked the captain whether the pressurization mode was on auto or manual. But instead of answering this, the captain repeated the same question again about where the circuit breakers were located. During this conversation, the oxygen masks for the passengers had dropped inside the plane. Shortly after this, Helios ground operations lost contact with the plane. Slowly but surely, the aircraft reached 34,000 feet, and now all attempts to contact it seemed to be failing. Now, Helios operations contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control and asked them to try and contact Flight 522. For the next 5 minutes, the controller tried to contact the aircraft, but there was no response. Then the controller contacted another aircraft near Flight 522 and asked them to try to contact Flight 522, but this method also failed. Meanwhile, Flight 522 had now entered Greek airspace without permission and continued its flight plan. Nicosia Air Traffic Control Tower also tried to contact Flight 522 on the emergency frequency, but there was no response from here either. Then they contacted Athens ATC in Greece and asked whether they had been in contact with Flight 522 or not. But unfortunately, there was no response to their radio calls from the aircraft either. Now, there were two possibilities here. Either there was a radio transmission issue in Flight 522, due to which they were able to hear calls, but their responses were not being transmitted, or both pilots had been taken hostage. Keeping the first possibility in mind, Athens Control Tower gave the aircraft permission to descend, but there was no sign of descending from Flight 522. Despite contacting more than 20 times, when there was no response, Athens ATC was forced to contact the Greek Air Force and informed them that Flight 522 had entered the airspace without permission, and messages were not being answered. The Greek Air Force immediately sent 2 F-16 jets to intercept. At this time, Flight 522 was perfectly following its flight path on autopilot. The point where it was supposed to descend had already been missed twice, but the aircraft was still flying at 34,000 feet. At 7:37 a.m., Flight 522 established a holding pattern over Athens Airport. A holding pattern is a pattern in which the aircraft circles over the airport and establishes a landing approach upon receiving permission. When they were on the 6th round of the holding pattern, both F-16s intercepted them. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. One of the pilots from the 2 F-16s gave a very surprising report. He said that the captain's seat in the cockpit of Flight 522 was lying empty. They also looked inside the passenger cabin. In the light from the windows on the other side, they could see the cabin clearly. There, passengers were sitting absolutely motionless in their seats, while oxygen masks were on their faces. When the aircraft was making the 10th round of the holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots saw a strange sight. A person wearing a light blue shirt and a black vest entered the cockpit and sat in the captain's seat. He put on headphones and placed his hands on the panel in front of him. The pilot signaled to the person in the cockpit with their hands, to which he responded by waving his hand, but a few moments later, the plane's left engine shut down. After this, the plane tilted sharply to the left and began descending toward the ground. Shortly before 9 a.m., the aircraft turned further to the left, and after that, its right engine also shut down. About 4 minutes later, it crashed into the hills northwest of Athens and was destroyed. Immediately after the accident, investigators got to work. They examined the wreckage and also questioned the engineer who had performed maintenance work on the plane before the accident. A night before the accident, the same engineer had performed a pressurization leak test on the aircraft. During this test, he had moved the pressurization mode on the overhead panel from auto to the manual position. But after finishing the work, he forgot to put the switch back to auto. The aircraft was flying at an altitude of 34,000 feet, and because of the manual position, the air pressure inside began to decrease. In low pressure, the human brain can only function for 10 minutes, and this condition is called hypoxia, meaning a lack of oxygen. Its first effect is on the brain, which leads to confusion, decreased thinking ability, and eventually unconsciousness or death. Both pilots were supposed to check this switch in their pre-flight duties, but they did not notice because normally that switch is in the auto position. They had 2 more opportunities to identify the problem: before taxiing and after takeoff, but they lost every chance. When the aircraft went above 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning alarm started ringing, but the pilot's attention went toward the takeoff configuration warning instead of the pressurization system. In this misunderstanding, they started the procedure that is usually done on the runway before takeoff, and thus they completely ignored the real issue. Meanwhile, oxygen masks came out in the aircraft and the "pass oxy on" light turned on. But due to the initial effects of hypoxia, they probably did not notice this either. This was the time when the captain and first officer became unconscious, and after the 10-minute oxygen supply ended, the passengers and crew also lost consciousness. Now the question arises: who was that person in the cockpit who had reached there 2 hours after they became unconscious? Investigation revealed that he was flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who held a commercial pilot license but was not qualified to fly a 737. It was discovered from the cockpit voice recorder that Prodromou had also tried to make mayday calls after the engines failed, but he accidentally forgot to press the transmit button. The investigation board concluded that his flying expertise was not enough to control a Boeing 737, especially when the engines had failed due to fuel exhaustion. And even if he had somehow managed to land the aircraft, the survival of the passengers and crew was impossible because hypoxia for such a long duration causes irreversible damage to the brain. During the investigation, 3 out of 4 portable oxygen cylinders were found in a used condition in the wreckage. This proved that Prodromou and perhaps 2 other cabin crew members had used these cylinders, due to which they remained conscious longer than the other passengers and pilots. After the Helios Flight 522 accident, the aviation industry learned a lot, and many new SOPs were created, in which Boeing was instructed to increase pilot training and understand the difference in warnings. After implementing these SOPs, an accident like Helios Flight 522 has not happened again to this day. Hope you all will like and share this video.